In 1917, the world convulses as the Bolshevik Revolution shatters the old order in Russia, sending shockwaves across the globe. A new ideology, communism, rises from the ashes of empire, promising a workers' paradise, a classless society, and a radical departure from the capitalist systems that dominate the globe. Vladimir Lenin, the revolution's architect, envisions a worldwide uprising, a permanent revolution that will sweep away the bourgeois states like dust. This vision immediately sets communism on a collision course with the established capitalist powers, who view the Bolshevik experiment with a mixture of fear and contempt, like a dangerous contagion. The seeds of a profound ideological clash are sown, a conflict that will define the next 70 years. The Western powers, particularly the United States and Great Britain, see in Soviet Russia a fundamental threat to their economic and political structures, a hostile flag planted on new ground. They intervene, sending troops to support the White Russian forces during the brutal Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1922, a move that only deepens Soviet distrust of the West, like a fresh wound. Winston Churchill famously declares Bolshevism must be strangled in its cradle. This early intervention, though ultimately unsuccessful, hardens the Soviet perception of capitalist encirclement and fuels a defensive paranoia that will persist for decades, like a constant shadow. The nascent Soviet Union, under Lenin and later Joseph Stalin, begins to construct a formidable state apparatus, driven by a singular, all-encompassing ideology that demonizes capitalism as inherently exploitative and aggressive. The interwar years, from 1919 to 1939, see a complex dance of diplomacy and suspicion, a series of hesitant steps on a minefield. While some Western nations, like Great Britain and France, eventually extend a hand of recognition to the Soviet Union, relations remain strained, a thin ice over deep water. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson and subsequent administrations, maintains a policy of non-recognition until 1933, viewing the Soviet regime as illegitimate and dangerous. This period also witnesses the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, ideologies that, while distinct from communism, share a totalitarian bent and a rejection of liberal democracy, like different brands of the same poison. The global economic crisis of the Great Depression, beginning in 1929, further complicates the ideological landscape, casting a long shadow over capitalist prosperity. Capitalism appears to be on the brink of collapse, seemingly validating Marxist predictions. The Soviet Union, isolated from the capitalist world, embarks on rapid industrialization and collectivization under Stalin's Iron Fist, a brutal process that costs millions of lives but transforms an agrarian society into an industrial power. Western intellectuals and workers, disillusioned with capitalism, sometimes look to the Soviet experiment with a mixture of hope and fear, drawn by its promise of full employment and social equality, even as reports of purges and famine begin to filter out like whispers in the wind. The rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany in the 1930s introduces a new, terrifying dimension to international relations, a storm cloud on the horizon. Hitler's virulent anti-communism and his expansionist ambitions in Eastern Europe create a strange, uneasy dynamic. The Soviet Union, recognizing the existential threat posed by Nazi Germany, attempts to forge alliances with Western powers against fascism. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, shocks the world. It includes secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowing Hitler to invade Poland without fear of a Soviet counterattack and providing the Soviet Union with a buffer zone. This cynical agreement, born of mutual suspicion and strategic calculation, highlights the profound distrust that permeates international relations. World War II erupts on September 1, 1939, as Germany invades Poland, pulling Great Britain and France into the conflict. For nearly 2 years, the Soviet Union remains officially neutral, benefiting from its pact with Germany while secretly strengthening its military. However, this uneasy truce shatters on June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. The invasion opens the Eastern Front, a theater of unparalleled brutality and scale, where millions will perish. The Soviet Union, now fighting for its very survival, becomes an unlikely ally of the Western democracies. The Grand Alliance of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union forms out of necessity, a coalition united by the singular goal of defeating Nazi Germany. Despite shared objectives, deep-seated ideological differences and mutual suspicions persist beneath the surface, like hidden currents. Winston Churchill, a staunch anti-communist, is wary of Soviet intentions even as he acknowledges their crucial role in the war. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president, holds a more pragmatic view, believing that a post-war cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union is possible. Joseph Stalin, ever suspicious, views Western delays in opening a second front in Western Europe as deliberate attempts to bleed the Soviet Union dry. Throughout the war, the Western Allies provide crucial Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, supplying vast quantities of tanks, planes, trucks, and food, totaling over $11 billion. This aid, while vital, does not entirely assuage Soviet suspicions. Stalin continues to press for a second front, viewing the Anglo-American campaigns in North Africa and Italy as insufficient. The D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, finally opened this second front, relieving some pressure on the Eastern Front, where the Red Army is systematically pushing the Wehrmacht back towards Germany. As the war draws to a close, the ideological fault lines become increasingly apparent, like cracks in a foundation. The Tehran Conference in November-December 1943 brings together Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin for the first time. Discussions focus on coordinating military strategy and post-war plans. Stalin demands significant territorial concessions and a free hand in Eastern Europe, arguing that these territories are essential for Soviet security, a buffer against future Western aggression. Churchill and Roosevelt, while recognizing the Soviet Union's immense sacrifices, express concerns about the self-determination of nations in Eastern Europe. The seeds of disagreement are clearly visible. The Yalta Conference in February 1945, with the defeat of Germany imminent, becomes a pivotal moment. The Big Three again convene to discuss the post-war order. Key agreements are reached. The Soviet Union pledges to enter the war against Japan after Germany's surrender. Germany will be divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, American, British, and French, and a new international organization, the United Nations, will be created. Crucially, the Declaration on Liberated Europe is signed, promising free and unfettered elections in territories liberated from Nazi control. However, the interpretation of free and unfettered quickly becomes a point of contention. Stalin views friendly governments in Eastern Europe as essential for Soviet security, a definition that will soon clash with Western democratic ideals. The Soviet occupation of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria already gives them a de facto advantage, and the Red Army's presence casts a long shadow over the future of these nations. As the war in Europe concludes with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, the alliance of convenience begins to fray, like a rope under strain. The immediate common enemy is gone, replaced by a vacuum of power and conflicting visions for the future. Roosevelt's death in April 1945 brings Harry S. Truman to the American presidency, a man less inclined to trust Stalin than his predecessor. Truman enters office with a tougher stance toward the Soviet Union, reflecting a growing American concern about Soviet expansionism in Eastern Europe. He is also informed of the top-secret Manhattan Project and the impending successful test of an atomic bomb, a game-changing weapon that will profoundly alter the balance of power. The final act of this wartime collaboration, and the true beginning of the Cold War, unfolds at the Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945. Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee after the British general election, gather outside Berlin amidst the ruins of a defeated Germany. The atmosphere is palpably different from Yalta, colder, sharper. Truman, now aware of the atomic bomb's power, adopts a more assertive posture. Discussions quickly devolve into disagreements over the future of Germany, reparations, and the precise boundaries and political structures of Eastern European nations. Stalin refuses to budge on his demand for a Soviet sphere of influence, citing security concerns and the immense human cost of the war. The Western Allies, particularly the United States, express growing alarm over the Soviet Union's imposition of communist-dominated governments in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, in clear violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the Yalta Agreements. The conference ends without a comprehensive peace settlement, reflecting a fundamental divergence in objectives and a complete lack of mutual trust. The ideological chasm, present since 1917, now manifests as an unbridgeable political divide. The world stands at the precipice of a new, prolonged conflict, not of hot war, but of simmering distrust and ideological confrontation. The Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945, where Allied leaders failed to agree on the post-war order, marking a clear division. The world now enters a new era, one defined by the looming shadow of the atomic bomb and the stark reality of two competing superpowers, each convinced of the righteousness of its own system and the existential threat posed by the other. The very air crackles with suspicion. In August 1945, the United States unleashes the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, bringing a swift end to the war with Japan. This devastating display of power not only concludes the global conflict, but also sends a chilling message to Moscow, like a thunderclap across continents. The Soviet Union, though developing its own nuclear program, is now acutely aware of American military superiority, fueling both fear and a desperate drive to catch up. The immediate post-war years are characterized by a rapid hardening of positions. In March 1946, Winston Churchill, speaking in Fulton, Missouri, declares that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. His words vividly articulate the growing division between Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe and the democratic West, a division that is becoming increasingly impermeable, like solid steel. This speech is widely seen as a declaration of the Cold War. Throughout 1946 and 1947, the Soviet Union consolidates its control over Eastern Europe. People's democracies are established in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, often through rigged elections, intimidation, and the systematic suppression of opposition parties, like a heavy boot-crushing descent. Yugoslavia, under Josip Broz Tito, charts a more independent communist course, a subtle but significant crack in the Soviet bloc. In Greece, a civil war rages, pitting the communist-backed Democratic Army of Greece against the royalist government, supported by Britain. As Britain, economically exhausted by the war, signals its inability to continue supporting Greece and Turkey, the United States steps in. On March 12, 1947, President Truman delivers a landmark speech to Congress, articulating what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. He pledges American support to free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, effectively committing the United States to a global struggle against the spread of communism. This doctrine marks a fundamental shift in American foreign policy, from isolationism to active interventionism. Following the Truman Doctrine, the United States launches the Marshall Plan in June 1947, officially known as the European Recovery Program. This ambitious initiative provides over $13 billion, equivalent to over $150 billion today, in economic aid to rebuild war-torn Western European economies, like a massive infusion of lifeblood. The goals are multifaceted: to prevent economic collapse that could foster communist movements, to create stable trading partners for the U.S., and to demonstrate the superiority of the capitalist system. The Soviet Union condemns the Marshall Plan as dollar imperialism and forbids its satellite states from participating, further entrenching the economic division of Europe. In September 1947, the Soviet Union responds by establishing the Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau, a centralized body designed to coordinate communist parties in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, ensuring ideological conformity and obedience to Moscow, like a conductor orchestrating an orchestra. This move signals a renewed offensive in the ideological battle. The year 1948 witnesses the first major direct confrontation of the Cold War. In February, a communist coup in Czechoslovakia, orchestrated with Soviet backing, overthrows the democratically elected government, bringing the nation firmly into the Soviet orbit, like a captured pawn. This event shocks the West, serving as a stark reminder of Soviet intentions. Then, in June 1948, the Soviet Union imposes a blockade on all land and water access to West Berlin, a democratic enclave deep within Soviet-occupied East Germany. Stalin's objective is to force the Western powers out of Berlin, asserting full Soviet control over the former German capital. The United States and Great Britain respond with the Berlin Airlift, a monumental logistical operation that delivers food, fuel, and supplies to West Berliners by air for nearly a year. For 323 days, from June 24, 1948 to May 12, 1949, Allied planes make over 277,000 flights, delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies, a constant roar in the sky. The airlift is a triumph of Western resolve and a humiliating setback for Stalin, who ultimately lifts the blockade. The Berlin blockade solidifies the division of Germany. In May 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, is established, a democratic state aligned with the West. In October 1949, the German Democratic Republic East Germany is proclaimed, a communist state under Soviet control, a mirror image facing east. The formation of military alliances now becomes paramount. In April 1949, 12 nations, including the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, and Italy, sign the North Atlantic Treaty, creating NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is a collective defense alliance, stating that an attack on one member is an attack on all, an unprecedented peacetime commitment by the United States to the defense of Western Europe, a shield against aggression. This alliance is explicitly designed to deter Soviet aggression. The balance of power shifts dramatically in August 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully detonates its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning by the West. This event, years ahead of American intelligence estimates, shatters the U.S. nuclear monopoly and ushers in a terrifying new era of nuclear parity, like a second, equally destructive sun. The stakes of the Cold War suddenly become immeasurably higher. As the nuclear arms race accelerates, so does the ideological struggle across the globe. In October 1949, Mao Zedong's Communist Party of China emerges victorious in the Chinese Civil War, establishing the People's Republic of China. This immense nation, with a quarter of the world's population, now aligns itself with the Soviet Union, a monumental blow to American foreign policy and a perceived expansion of the communist threat across Asia. The defeated nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, retreats to Taiwan. The global nature of the Cold War becomes brutally apparent in June 1950 when North Korea, a communist state backed by the Soviet Union and China, invades South Korea, a US-supported republic. This invasion marks the first hot war of the Cold War, a proxy conflict fought on a brutal scale. The United Nations Security Council, with the Soviet delegate absent in protest of China's UN seat, authorizes a US-led coalition to defend South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur commands the UN forces, pushing deep into North Korea. China, fearing a US presence on its border, intervenes en masse in November 1950, driving UN forces back across the 38th parallel. The Korean War becomes a bloody stalemate, lasting until an armistice is signed in July 1953. Over 2.5 million people perish, and the peninsula remains divided, a stark reminder of the Cold War's human cost. The early 1950s also see the rise of intense anti-communist paranoia within the United States, a period known as the Second Red Scare or McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy exploits public fears, making unsubstantiated accusations of communist infiltration in government and other institutions, leading to blacklists, loyalty oaths, and widespread suspicion, like a spreading contagion of fear. This internal struggle reflects the deep-seated anxieties of a nation grappling with a perceived existential threat. In March 1953, Joseph Stalin, the architect of Soviet totalitarianism and a central figure in the early Cold War, dies. His death sparks a power struggle within the Kremlin and ushers in a period of de-Stalinization under new leadership, most notably Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev denounces Stalin's cult of personality and some of his excesses, hinting at a potential thaw in Soviet-Western relations, though the ideological conflict remains. In response to NATO, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states formalized their military alliance in May 1955 with the creation of the Warsaw Pact. This mutual defense treaty solidifies the two opposing blocs, effectively creating a heavily armed standoff across the Iron Curtain, like two coiled serpents facing each other. The Cold War extends beyond military and economic spheres, permeating culture, science, and technology. The space race ignites in October 1957 when the Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, a metallic sphere beeping its challenge from orbit. This scientific achievement shocks the United States, which fears Soviet technological superiority and its potential military implications. The U.S. responds with renewed investment in science education and the creation of NASA in 1958, intensifying the competition to reach the moon and beyond. In 1956, the Soviet Union brutally suppresses the Hungarian Revolution, a popular uprising against Soviet control. Soviet tanks roll into Budapest, crushing the rebellion and demonstrating Moscow's unwavering commitment to maintaining its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, like an iron fist. The West, while condemning the intervention, does not militarily intervene, highlighting the tacit understanding of each superpower's respective spheres. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the arms race reaches a new level of sophistication with the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Both the US and the USSR now possess the capability to deliver nuclear warheads across vast distances, leading to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, where a first strike by either side would inevitably lead to its own annihilation. This terrifying reality shapes strategic thinking and underscores the fragility of global peace. The Sino-Soviet split begins to emerge in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Ideological differences, border disputes, and differing approaches to international communism lead to a growing rift between Beijing and Moscow, weakening the unity of the communist bloc and adding another layer of complexity to the Cold War. In 1960, a U.S. U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, is shot down over Soviet territory. The incident, initially denied by the U.S., exposes high-altitude surveillance missions and leads to the collapse of a planned superpower summit in Paris, further escalating tensions. The Cold War arrives on America's doorstep in January 1959, when Fidel Castro leads a communist revolution in Cuba, overthrowing the pro-US dictator Fulgencio Batista. Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, quickly aligns itself with the Soviet Union, providing Moscow with a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere, like a dagger pointed at the heartland. The U.S. responds with economic sanctions and covert attempts to destabilize the Castro regime. In April 1961, the United States, under President John F. Kennedy, supports an invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion is a catastrophic failure, strengthening Castro's position and humiliating the Kennedy administration. This botched operation further pushes Cuba into the arms of the Soviet Union. In August 1961, the Soviet Union and East Germany construct the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier designed to stop the flow of East Germans fleeing to West Berlin and seeking freedom in the West. The wall becomes the most potent symbol of the Cold War's division, a stark concrete manifestation of the Iron Curtain, a scar across the city. The world holds its breath in October 1962 as the Cold War reaches its most dangerous point. American U-2 spy planes discover Soviet ballistic missiles being secretly installed in Cuba. These medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles, capable of striking major U.S. cities within minutes, represent an unacceptable threat to American security. President Kennedy demands their removal and imposes a naval blockade, or quarantine, around Cuba to prevent further Soviet military shipments. For 13 days, from October 16 to October 28, 1962, the world teeters on the brink of nuclear war, a single spark away from global incineration. Soviet ships approach the blockade line, and both sides prepare for military confrontation. Secret negotiations unfold between Washington and Moscow. The world holds its breath in October 1962 as the Cold War reaches its most dangerous point. American U-2 spy planes discover Soviet ballistic missiles being secretly installed in Cuba. These medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles, capable of striking major U.S. cities within minutes, represent an unacceptable threat to American security. President Kennedy demands their removal and imposes a naval blockade, or quarantine, around Cuba to prevent further Soviet military shipments. For 13 days, from October 16 to October 28, 1962, the world teeters on the brink of nuclear war. Soviet ships approach the blockade line, and both sides prepare for military confrontation. Secret negotiations unfold between Washington and Moscow. Finally, a resolution emerges. The Soviet Union agrees to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a terrifying near-miss, underscores the urgent need for direct communication between the superpowers. In June 1963, the hotline is established, a direct teletype link between the Pentagon and the Kremlin, designed to prevent future misunderstandings and accidental escalation. This crisis serves as a stark reminder of the perils of nuclear brinkmanship and ushers in a period of cautious détente. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis sees a renewed push for arms control. In August 1963, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. This treaty, while not ending the arms race, significantly reduces the immediate environmental and health risks associated with nuclear fallout and symbolizes a small step towards de-escalation. However, the ideological battle continues to rage, particularly in Southeast Asia. The United States becomes increasingly entangled in Vietnam, a nation divided between a communist North and a US-backed South. The roots of the conflict stretch back to French colonial rule and the post-World War II struggle for independence. The US views the conflict through the lens of the domino theory, believing that if one nation falls to communism, others in the region will inevitably follow, like a chain reaction. American involvement escalates dramatically after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, leading to congressional authorization for military action. By 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson commits large numbers of U.S. ground troops to Vietnam, initiating a full-scale military intervention. The Vietnam War becomes a brutal and protracted conflict, characterized by guerrilla warfare, extensive bombing campaigns, and massive civilian casualties. It exposes deep divisions within American society and sparks widespread anti-war protests. While the U.S. is bogged down in Vietnam, the Soviet Union continues to assert its control over Eastern Europe. In August 1968, Soviet-led Warsaw Pact forces invade Czechoslovakia to suppress the Prague Spring, a period of political liberalization and reform under First Secretary Alexander Dubček. The invasion, involving hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of tanks, crushes the reforms and reasserts Moscow's absolute authority, demonstrating the limits of autonomy for satellite states within the Soviet bloc. The Brezhnev Doctrine, articulated by Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, justifies this intervention, declaring that the Soviet Union has the right to intervene in any socialist country where socialism is threatened. The late 1960s and early 1970s bring about a complex period known as détente, characterized by a reduction in Cold War tensions and increased diplomatic engagement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The devastating cost of the arms race and the shared experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis contribute to this shift. President Richard Nixon, advised by Henry Kissinger, pursues a strategy of triangular diplomacy, seeking to exploit the Sino-Soviet split. In February 1972, Nixon makes a historic visit to China, normalizing relations after decades of isolation. This move puts pressure on the Soviet Union, which fears a US-China alliance. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, become a cornerstone of détente. In May 1972, Nixon visits Moscow, and the two superpowers sign the SALT-I Treaty, the first major agreement to limit the production of strategic nuclear weapons. This treaty caps the number of intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, launchers and submarine-launched ballistic missile, SLBM, launchers for both sides, and it also includes an anti-ballistic missile, ABM, treaty limiting defensive missile systems. SALT-I symbolizes a mutual recognition of the devastating consequences of unchecked nuclear proliferation and a desire to manage the arms race, if not end it. However, the war in Vietnam continues to cast a long shadow. After years of intense fighting, mounting casualties, and domestic unrest, the United States withdraws its combat troops in 1973. In April 1975, Saigon falls to North Vietnamese forces, and Vietnam is unified under communist rule. The war represents a significant setback for American foreign policy, demonstrating the limitations of military power against determined nationalist movements and the complexities of proxy conflicts. Despite the end of the Vietnam War, détente remains fragile. The Soviet Union continues its military buildup, particularly in conventional forces and strategic nuclear weapons, raising concerns in the West. Ideological competition persists, with both superpowers supporting client states and revolutionary movements around the globe. In 1975, the Helsinki Accords are signed by 35 nations, including the US, Canada, and all European states except Albania. These accords aim to improve relations between the communist bloc and the West, establishing principles for sovereignty, non-intervention, and human rights. While largely non-binding, the human rights provisions become a tool for dissidents in Eastern Europe to challenge their regimes. The late 1970s witness a decline in détente as new crises emerge. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to prop up a pro-Soviet government facing widespread insurgency. This unprovoked invasion, involving tens of thousands of Soviet troops, shocks the international community and is widely condemned. The US, under President Jimmy Carter, responds by imposing sanctions, boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and providing covert aid to the Afghan Mujahideen resistance fighters. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan marks a significant turning point, effectively ending the period of détente and ushering in a renewed era of Cold War confrontation. The election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States in November 1980 signals a decisive shift in American Cold War policy. Reagan, a staunch anti-communist, adopts a confrontational stance towards the Soviet Union, which he famously labels an evil empire, in March 1983. He advocates for a massive military buildup, rejecting the notion of parity and seeking to achieve military superiority over the Soviets. This aggressive approach aims to place immense economic strain on the Soviet system, believing that its centralized economy cannot compete with the capitalist West in an arms race. Reagan's administration initiates several key strategic programs. In March 1983, he announces the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, dubbed Star Wars by the media, a controversial proposal to develop a space-based missile defense system. While critics argue about its feasibility and potential to destabilize the nuclear balance, SDI sends a clear message to Moscow that the US is prepared to push technological boundaries. The deployment of new intermediate-range nuclear missiles, such as the Pershing II in West Germany and cruise missiles in Europe, further escalates tensions and sparks widespread protests across the continent. Meanwhile, within the Soviet Union, the aging leadership faces mounting domestic problems. The Soviet economy stagnates, burdened by massive military spending, inefficient central planning, and corruption. Consumer goods are scarce, and technological innovation lags far behind the West. The war in Afghanistan drains resources and morale, becoming a Soviet Vietnam. Social unrest simmers beneath the surface, particularly in Eastern Europe, where the Solidarity movement in Poland gains significant momentum in the early 1980s. Led by Lech Walesa, Solidarity, an independent trade union, challenges the communist government, inspiring hope for reform but also prompting fears of Soviet intervention. In December 1981, the Polish government, under pressure from Moscow, imposes martial law to suppress Solidarity, arresting thousands of activists. The early 1980s are marked by a dangerous rhetoric and several close calls. In September 1983, a Soviet fighter jet shoots down Korean Airlines Flight 7, a civilian airliner that had strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people on board, including a U.S. congressman. The incident heightens global tensions and fuels anti-Soviet sentiment. Just weeks later, in November 1983, NATO conducts Exercise Able Archer 83, a realistic command post-exercise simulating a nuclear war. Some Soviet leaders mistakenly interpret the exercise as a genuine prelude to a first strike, bringing the world once again to the brink of nuclear conflict. The incident reveals the perilous lack of trust and the potential for miscalculation during this intense period. The increasing pressure from the West, coupled with the internal decay of the Soviet system, creates a desperate need for change within the Kremlin. The succession of elderly and infirm leaders, Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, and Konstantin Chernenko, in rapid succession between 1982 and 1985, underscores the systemic crisis. The Soviet Union is in dire need of a new vision, a leader capable of addressing its profound economic and social problems. In March 1985, a new figure emerges from the Kremlin's shadows. Mikhail Gorbachev, a relatively young and energetic leader, assumes the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He inherits a nation in profound crisis, its economy sputtering, its people disillusioned, and its international standing weakened by the costly Afghan war and the relentless arms race. Gorbachev recognizes the urgent need for fundamental change, a radical departure from the rigid doctrines of the past. He introduces two revolutionary policies: glasnost asterisk, or openness, and perestroika asterisk, or restructuring. Glasnost aims to increase transparency in government activities and reduce censorship, fostering a more open discussion of political and social issues. This unprecedented move allows for greater freedom of speech and access to information, exposing the systemic failures and corruption that had long been suppressed. Perestroika asterisk, meanwhile, seeks to revitalize the stagnant Soviet economy by introducing elements of market-based reforms, decentralizing decision-making, and encouraging private enterprise. These reforms, while initially cautious, represent a profound challenge to the foundational principles of Soviet communism. Gorbachev's ascent marks a pivotal moment in the Cold War. Unlike his predecessors, he believes that the Soviet Union cannot sustain the arms race with the United States and simultaneously address its internal economic woes. He seeks to de-escalate tensions with the West, recognizing that confrontation is unsustainable. A series of historic summits with U.S. President Ronald Reagan soon follows, beginning in Geneva in November 1985. These meetings, initially marked by deep ideological differences, gradually build a surprising personal rapport between the two leaders. While significant breakthroughs are not immediately achieved, the groundwork is laid for future cooperation. The Reykjavik Summit in October 1986 proves to be a dramatic turning point. In a stunning proposal, Gorbachev suggests the elimination of all nuclear weapons by both superpowers. Reagan, while open to deep cuts, is unwilling to abandon his Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which he views as a crucial defensive shield. The summit ultimately ends without an agreement, but the sheer ambition of Gorbachev's offer electrifies the world and reveals his genuine desire for disarmament. The discussions, though inconclusive, demonstrate a new level of frankness and a shared understanding of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war. Back in the Soviet Union, asterisk glasnost begins to unleash forces that Gorbachev struggles to control. Previously forbidden topics, from environmental disasters like the Chernobyl nuclear accident in April 1986 to the inefficiencies of collective farming, are openly discussed in the media. Dissidents once imprisoned are released, and historical injustices, such as the crimes of Stalin, are acknowledged. This newfound openness, however, also fuels nationalist sentiments within the Soviet republics, particularly in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940. Calls for greater autonomy and eventually independence begin to grow louder. In December 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty in Washington, D.C. This landmark agreement eliminates an entire class of nuclear weapons, all land-based ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. It is the first time the two superpowers agree to eliminate, rather than merely limit, nuclear weapons, a testament to the changing dynamics of the Cold War and Gorbachev's commitment to arms reduction. The treaty includes unprecedented on-site verification measures, fostering a new level of trust and transparency between the former adversaries. The withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, beginning in May 1988 and completed by February 1989, further signals a shift in Soviet foreign policy. The decade-long war had been a devastating drain on Soviet resources and morale, often called the bleeding wound. Its end removes a major point of contention with the West and demonstrates Gorbachev's willingness to abandon the Brezhnev Doctrine's aggressive posture. Gorbachev's reforms also have profound implications for Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, weakened economically and increasingly preoccupied with its internal struggles, is no longer willing or able to prop up its satellite regimes through military force. In a speech to the United Nations in December 1988, Gorbachev implicitly rejects the Brezhnev Doctrine, stating that nations have the right to choose their own destinies. This declaration sends a clear signal to Eastern European leaders. Moscow will no longer intervene to suppress reform movements. The year 1989 becomes a year of astonishing, rapid-fire change across Eastern Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, once brutally suppressed, is legalized in April. Round-table talks between the government and Solidarity lead to semi-free elections in June, resulting in a landslide victory for Solidarity candidates. Tadeusz Mazowiecki becomes the first non-communist prime minister in Eastern Europe since the late 1940s, a truly revolutionary development. Hungary, too, embraces reform, opening its border with Austria in May, creating a direct escape route for East Germans. The exodus of East Germans through Hungary and Czechoslovakia intensifies throughout the summer of 1989, putting immense pressure on the East German regime. Mass protests erupt in cities like Leipzig and Dresden, with hundreds of thousands demanding freedom and democratic reforms. The iconic chants of Wir sind das Volk, "We are the people," echo through the streets. The East German leadership, facing an unprecedented wave of popular dissent and lacking Soviet support, finds itself in an untenable position. On November 9, 1989, in a moment that captures the imagination of the world, the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War's division, falls. A confused announcement by an East German official regarding new travel regulations leads to thousands of East Berliners converging on the wall's checkpoints. Border guards, overwhelmed and without clear orders, eventually open the gates. People stream across, embracing West Berliners, dancing on the wall, and chipping away at its concrete with hammers and chisels. The fall of the Berlin Wall is a moment of pure euphoria, signifying the collapse of communist control in East Germany and signaling the imminent end of the Iron Curtain. The domino effect continues unabated. Czechoslovakia experiences the Velvet Revolution in November, a largely peaceful transition from communism to democracy, culminating in the election of Václav Havel, a former dissident playwright, as president. In Romania, however, the transition is violent. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Alina are overthrown and executed in December after a brutal crackdown on protests. Bulgaria also sees its communist leadership step down. By the end of 1989, the Soviet bloc, as it had existed for over 4 decades, is effectively dismantled. The reunification of Germany, long a distant dream, rapidly becomes a reality. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, with the support of the US, and a surprisingly amenable Gorbachev, pushes for swift unification. Despite initial reservations from France and the United Kingdom, who fear a powerful united Germany, the process moves forward. In October 1990, East and West Germany are formally reunified, becoming the Federal Republic of Germany. This event, unimaginable just a few years prior, fundamentally alters the geopolitical landscape of Europe. As Eastern Europe liberates itself, the Soviet Union itself begins to unravel. Glasnost and perestroika, intended to save the Soviet system, paradoxically accelerate its demise. The newfound freedom of expression emboldens nationalist movements in the Soviet republics. The Baltic states declare independence in 1990 and 1991, their sovereignty eventually recognized by Moscow. Other republics, from Ukraine to Georgia, also assert their independence, weakening the central government's authority. A desperate attempt by hardline communists to seize power and reverse Gorbachev's reforms occurs in August 1991. The August coup, led by conservative elements within the KGB and military, briefly places Gorbachev under house arrest. However, the coup quickly collapses in the face of widespread popular resistance, particularly in Moscow, where Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Federation, rallies opposition from atop a tank. The failure of the coup utterly discredits the Communist Party and accelerates the Soviet Union's disintegration. Following the coup, the remaining Soviet republics rapidly declare their independence. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns as president of the Soviet Union. The next day, December 26, 1991, the Supreme Soviet formally dissolves itself, declaring the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The red flag with the hammer and sickle is lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. The Cold War, the ideological and geopolitical struggle that had dominated the second half of the 20th century, is over. The collapse of the Soviet Union leaves a complex legacy. The world is transformed from a bipolar system to a unipolar one, with the United States emerging as the sole superpower. New independent nations arise from the ashes of the Soviet Empire, facing the daunting task of building democratic institutions and market economies. While the threat of nuclear annihilation recedes, new challenges emerge, including regional conflicts, ethnic strife, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The end of the Cold War is a triumph for democracy and freedom, demonstrating the resilience of human spirit against totalitarianism. It is a testament to the power of ideas, the courage of dissidents, and the unwavering commitment of nations to self-determination. The Berlin Wall, once an impenetrable barrier, now stands in fragments, a powerful reminder of a divided past and a symbol of hope for a future defined by cooperation rather than confrontation. The Cold War may have ended, but its lessons about the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of peace, and the enduring human desire for liberty continue to resonate.